idea of sort of rewriting history to construct these communities as totally separate. But it was also on a lot of different levels. For example, after 1857, the British set out to carry out very, very detailed censuses of the Indian people, and every single person was classified according to what caste the British basically decided that they were, and what community they belonged to, and so on. And they even defined these different communities as belonging to different races, because this was the period when, you know, of social Darwinism and ideas about race, and the sort of consolidation of racist ideologies, ideas about racial superiority. So obviously, India was a highly, on one level, a highly divided society. There were divisions of caste, very significant class divisions, as well as different faiths. But you know, there was a very deliberate attempt, particularly after 1857, to really make that the main way that people saw themselves. And in fact, you know, that then became a way, later on, you know, there were things like separate electorates and so on, and basically by identifying with one of these communities, was the only way that you could get anything from the state. So you had to belong there. You know, organizing across those boundaries wouldn't really give you access to anything within the framework of the British colonial state. So there were very deliberate attempts made to reinforce those. And they sat back after 1857 and thought, how can we avoid this happening again? This is one of the things that they did.
Okay, are there any more questions or comments? Stunned silence, come on. John.
It's a comment really. I enjoyed the historical crawl through the background to East India Company, but inevitably, because it's the most recent thing that you said, the trite remark about Marx and Burke. I mean, Burke clearly wanted everybody to be accountable to the bourgeois parliamentary democracy in this country. What Marx was looking forward to was the independence of people under their own self-determination in India, and the regeneration of India under that control. And I think that ought to redress the balance a little bit with the comment that you made earlier.
Do you want to?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, I think Burke's hostility to the East India Company was because he was a conservative, and he wanted the situation in India to, in a sense, the traditional order to remain, just as he wanted the traditional order in France. But that meant, I think, that he did have a huge sense of solidarity. The problem with Marx, I think, as with where he shared with a lot of people of his time, was he had this idea of a hierarchy of nations, hierarchy of civilizations, and so he took, I think, a fairly misguided view of India, seeing it as wholly sterile, backward, and hadn't really been developing, which I think now has been seen to be not accurate. And so that's why I think he saw the British intrusion as the force for regeneration, whereas I think many people from India would say, well, you don't need the British to actually develop. So I think that it's a complex part, but I think what we can now look on is actually looking at these people with a little bit of distance. So I'm not saying one is right or wrong, but they had different views. We can learn from all sides, I think.
Elton, I wanted to.
Yeah, no, I just want to come back on this as well, because I think it's interesting because, you know, in the context of remembering 1857, a lot of people on the left in India are looking again at what Marx wrote about 1857, because as people have said, he was actually one of the journalists here who did some of the most coverage of it. And I mean, I think, yes, you know, obviously we need to recognize these issues in Marx's work, but I think one of the things which really comes up when you look at those reports is the fact that he was very supportive of what was happening and quite inspired by what was happening in 1857. In a way, his vision of, you know, India as a stagnant society was very much of his time, and it was very much in terms of what was available at that time. But I think, on the other hand, you know, he did recognize that this was something very progressive in his view, which was happening in India. And he's, in fact, you know, the one who coined the term India's first war of independence from the British, you know, in Britain. So that's also worth remembering, I think.
into England because of the bourgeois, like how the merchants here were being affected, and how Edward Burke and Karl Marx and Adam Smith, their opinions, that was really, really interesting. I thought that was a good thing to kind of point out, because there were people who obviously thought that it wasn't a good thing that was happening, and it wasn't only like Indian people obviously before thinking it was a bad thing, it was also like the English doing that. Thanks for pointing that out.
Yeah, it's not a question, it's cool. I think when we're saying India was divided between region this, but from from Meerut and Lucknow, the army went to Delhi and asked Bahadur Shah, that came that time, to lead them. Most of us are Hindu actually. So same thing I'm talking about. There was a free Irish government exile in India, which was in Jalandhar. Recently came out now. For 6 months, they flying their Irish flag, 1,000 soldiers. Nobody knew that. I came from near Jalandhar, I didn't know that. So a lot of history distorted, put it away, that kind of thing. But at that time, there was a struggle, all Indian, against British Raj.
But
Quick question then. Is there a monetary value being put on how much money was taken out of India by the East India Company, and what it would equivalent to today?
There have been some assessments, not recently though. There were some assessments in the 19th century about the value of the drain. And I think the big question, which I think a lot of historians still clash on, is to what extent that drain provided the sort of financial fuel for the Industrial Revolution. Because soon after Plassey in the 1750s, 1760s, 1770s, you have that coincidence of the technologies in the mill industry, which led to the successful industrial manufacture of cotton. So some historians have said actually it was because of the loot of India that which provided the financial capital, gave the kickstart, as it were, for these technologies which in many ways could exist but hadn't been utilized. And that's a view which seems to have some sense to it. I suppose more mainstream historians generally doubt that. But certainly at the time, I mean, and I suppose whenever there's a problem, the British Parliament set up a select committee. But there are lots and lots of documents just showing the scale of the drain, almost sort of immediately after Plassey. And I think the sadness is just adding to what was said there. There was, in a sense, to some extent, cultural and political resistance here. But in the end, the value of the money and the political power that the conquest of India brought was too great. And so principles were shoved to the bottom of the list. And that was the great tragedy, I think.
Okay. You said there were some estimates. What were those estimates?
they're in the book.
They're in the book. They're in the book. They're in the book.
You can I'll plug the book for you.
Yeah, they're in the book. But I mean, they're in the book. I mean, it would be in our money billions and billions. Yeah.
Dave, and then over there. Yeah, go on.
I think almost my first question follows on from that question, because I think there's a need to broaden out and talk about, in terms of the finances, the ways in which the balance of payments was operated in terms of international financing of imperial pursuits. So in terms of gold and silver, just coming out of a different form of exploitative colonialism in South America, that was actually a very important part of how and why the India Company went to use trade as a means of domination.
Yeah.
So a lot of the luxury items we talk about were actually being traded through other routes, which oftentimes didn't even need for those items to actually reach Britain. It was happening remotely. That's one point. The other is around, I know this is going to happen in the remainder of the afternoon, around connections, but I find it really interesting when you read a lot of the historical reflections on this time, going from Company Raj, when East India Company rule, to when it turns to being colonial Raj, British Raj, and the way it's sort of seen as a distancing between It didn't have legitimacy, it didn't have accountability in the state. Then suddenly the British government comes in, and then it becomes an exercise of colonial domination, social engineering. It becomes much wider as a project. But I think what is important for doing it now today is that I get irritated reading a lot of the kind of academic literature which tries to develop a way of looking at it which doesn't have a meaning for us today. I think what's missing, even though there is a lot of people's history that is being written, for us today to be talking about it, there's got to be a means by which we can say, okay, that was Company March, we have Company March today, National Community Cross. There's so many different types of connections, and how can a people's history, the way that we'd like to be talking about today, be informed about that history? I think that there's such a need for us to be talking today, and the papers are highlighting that, of documenting that, so other people are having these meetings and conferences, and they're writing, they're remembering different aspects of it. How can we build that resource of a real critical analysis of what happened back then to what's happening today?
But there was just one person here, and then
Kalpana, if you can recount salient points, salient factors why Indians lost that war, and what was the participation of South India in that war?
Are we on? No. Not yet. So we may have to stop to get onto the phone line, okay? But
yeah, I just can I come to that and also just briefly say something in response to what Dave said, because I think
we might.
In a way, we've got into a different mood, which is really great in terms of getting some idea about the whole nature of that resistance. I just really wanted to respond to what Dave said, because I thought that was very important about the fact that in a way it's back to company rule, in the sense of the power now of the of corporate capital and the transnational corporations which in South Asia. And I was just reminded about the situation in which I was talking about the special economic zones, where really now even the local government's powers have been suspended in those zones. So the corporations actually run those areas completely, and the people who previously lived there now have to have ID cards to even enter the areas. And what's interesting is, because of the level of resistance that the state faced from the people who lived in those areas in trying to set up these zones, the government has now taken a step back and said, well, in future, we won't be acquiring the land. It's up to the transnational corporations. They'll be given the power to actually go in directly and acquire that land for themselves and do their own negotiations. And we know that along with those negotiations comes intense repression and violence. So that prerogative will also be handed over to the corporations. And, we've seen this elsewhere in the world in terms of Shell, for example, and so many other companies. So I think it's really important to look at that. In terms of the whole question of why the Indians were defeated in 1857, which you were talking about, I mean, this is something where I'm sure there are lots of people here who can contribute their ideas on that, and in a way there's no one answer to that. But there are a lot of different speculations about it. And one of the things is that, of course, it was in a sense a failure of the intelligence issue in terms of the timing, because it was planned, it was thought about, strategized. One of the things which doesn't seem to have come into people's planning is the fact that there was reinforcements for the British were very close at hand. There was a fleet bringing British soldiers back from China, so they could reach very quickly. Whereas if they had to call for those reinforcements to sail from Britain, it would have taken a lot longer, and that clearly would have made a big difference. And there are a lot of other factors, but I think we tend to think always that it's because we were so divided, and I think that was the case in a lot of other situations. And of course, we know about the way, for example, in Plassey there was a betrayal from within. But I think 1857 shows a very different kind of picture from that. where people did in general unite. I think it's also linked to this whole question that to some extent it was actually creating something new. Although, you know, the Sipais were talking about bringing back the old rulers who were essentially feudal rulers and who were always vacillating about who to support. So there was that element which weakened them. But on the other hand, when you look at who really made the decisions in the uprisings, there was a whole new sort of source of power, which was the committees which the Sipai set up, which were democratically elected, which was something very, very new, and in a way more reminiscent maybe of what we saw 60 years later in the Soviets, you know, the whole idea of ordinary soldiers coming together, making decisions through elected bodies. And they were the ones who were really telling the figurehead rulers what should happen. So there is this whole thing about, yes, to some extent it was about bringing back the situation before the British, going back to those feudal rulers. But on the other hand, there was also a whole lot of new things. You can't really go backwards, and there were a whole lot of new ideas coming up then. That's it, yeah.
Actually, yeah. You wanted to say something?
Just a quick question. You know, what you said about the soft memory of 1857 and the soft memory of India in 1870. You know, perhaps you know, did you look at the literature? I mean, instead of just looking at history and sociology, did you also look at the literature where you find a certain fondness for the empire, the memory of the empire? Mm-hmm. So just, you know, a brief comment on it.
Yeah, I suppose I started this investigation of the East India Company by seeing the sort of the clash of these memories, in the sense that between how the East India Company is seen in Britain, which is generally it's been erased from history, but where it is remembered, it's remembered very romantically, and how it's seen in the cultures in India, particularly in fiction, and also in sort of the nationalist struggles. And I think that's what strikes me, is that I think it was lovely having the song, but also there's a whole series of plays and pamphlets and poetry in England against the East India Company. There was a play performed in 1773 called the Nabob, the Nabob, which was the English corruption of Nawab, which was the returning East India executive with bags of loot. And it was depicting the East India executives like the yuppies of the 1980s, 1990s. I mean, it was like Carol Churchill's Serious Money. I mean, so there was another play where Robert Clive was portrayed as a character called Lord Vulture. And so I think looking at these cultural aspects, I mean, looking both from the Indian perspective and the English perspective, is a very good way of, I think, broadening the discussion. So it's not just about the facts of history, but realizing that there was resistance, both physical but also cultural resistance. And some of the poetry, English poetry, is great. I mean, really rousing stuff. And I think reading one of the historians, he was saying, well, look, in a sense, the company has got away with it now, but the future historians will hold it to account. And I think the sadness is in Britain is that we're not.
Are there any other? Yes, Fernando, sorry. Yeah.
It was just sort of sitting here listening to the talks, and also I think particularly the song. In fact, something that really strikes me, and perhaps it's one of the reasons why the rebels turned to, in a sense, what was essentially sort of a feudal force, was that at least those past rulers treated people with humanity. And I think the element of racism that existed within the company rule and the dehumanization, well, enabled Hindus and Muslims to stand together against something which actually took away their humanity. And, maybe is one of the reasons why they turned to an older rule, despite the kind of inequalities and oppressions that existed there. And I just think that element of race, and it's quite interesting, Nick, in some of the critiques that you showed in Punch, they talk about the mismanagement, they talk about corruption, but one of the things those cartoonists are unable to actually articulate is the racism and the dehumanization. One thing that you may want to have a look at, you're talking about sort of current references to the East India Company. I don't know if you've seen any of the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, but they do
do have to break for tea, but Kalpana and Nick are here, so people can chat with them. And then we're going to start the second half in about 15 minutes. And Nick's book is at the back, and Aisha Siddiqa, her book is at the back as well. And then the Palestinian